Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little tense, a little unfair, and honestly, a little exhausting. So go ahead. Dim the lights, maybe adjust your pillow a bit, and let your mind slow down. Because tonight, we're drifting into a world where a single rumor could quietly ruin your life. Where a glance, a whisper, or just being a little too interesting could get you labeled with one very dangerous word. Adulteres. And the thing is, in history, that word didn't just mean scandal. It meant consequences. Very real ones, very uneven ones, and almost always directed at women. So let's just settle into that thought for a moment and gently wander back into a time where marriage wasn't really about love. It was about property, alliances, and control. And where stepping outside that arrangement, or even being accused of it, could quietly, steadily unravel everything. Now, in most pre-modern societies, marriage was less of a romantic partnership and more of a contractual obligation. You weren't just marrying a person. You were marrying into land, into power, into expectations. And for women, especially, marriage came with a very specific job description. Be loyal, be quiet, produce legitimate heirs. And ideally, don't cause any problems. Which, of course, sounds simple on paper, but in practice, was almost impossible. Because loyalty wasn't just about what you did. It was about what people thought you did. And unfortunately, people think a lot. Let's imagine a woman. We'll call her Eleanor, because that feels appropriately medieval and slightly tired already. Eleanor is married off at around 15, maybe younger. She doesn't know her husband very well, but that's fine, because knowing him isn't really part of the arrangement. He's older, he has land, he has expectations, and she has very little say in any of it. Now for a while, things are quiet. She does what she's told. She manages the household. She tries not to stand out too much. But then, maybe one day, someone notices something. Maybe she laughs a little too freely at dinner. Maybe she speaks to a visiting nobleman for a bit longer than necessary. Maybe she simply exists in a way that someone finds inconvenient. And just like that, the idea begins. It rarely starts with an accusation. That would be too direct. Too bold. No, it starts with a whisper. A small comment, something like, "She's quite friendly, isn't she?" Which sounds harmless. Almost polite. But in a society built on reputation, that's more than enough. Because once the idea is planted, it doesn't really need proof. It just needs repetition. And here's the uncomfortable part. Men, historically, were given a lot more flexibility in this area. A husband could have affairs, discreetly or not. And society would often just sigh and move on. Boys will be boys, they might say. Centuries before that phrase became annoying in modern times. But for women, there was no such leniency. Because for women, adultery wasn't just a moral issue. It was a legal one, a financial one, a dynastic crisis waiting to happen. Because if a woman had a child, and that child wasn't her husband's, well, that could disrupt inheritance. And inheritance was everything. So the stakes were high, unreasonably high. And because of that, suspicion alone could be enough to trigger consequences. Sometimes subtle, sometimes not subtle at all. Let's drift a little deeper into Eleanor's situation. The whispers have started. Nothing concrete. Nothing provable. But they're there, floating around the household, slipping into conversations, lingering just long enough to be noticed. Her husband hears them. Of course he does. Because in these settings, news travels fast. Especially the kind that damages reputations. And now, he has a decision to make. Ignore it, and risk looking weak, or act on it, and risk being wrong. And historically, men didn't like looking weak. So maybe he starts watching her more closely. Maybe he restricts where she goes, who she talks to, what she does with her time. Not openly, not dramatically. Just quietly tightening the boundaries. And Eleanor notices. Of course she does. but there's not much she can say, because defending yourself against something vague is incredibly difficult. It's like trying to prove you didn't think a thought. And over time, the pressure builds, not just from her husband, but from everyone around her. Servants begin to act differently. Friends become less friendly. Conversations stop when she enters the room. There's a distance now, a quiet judgment. And it doesn't really matter whether she's done anything wrong, because socially, she's already been marked. Now, depending on where and when this is happening, the consequences can vary. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because the slow unraveling is often the most exhausting part. The part where nothing is official, but everything feels off, where you're not accused outright, but you're also not trusted anymore, where your world shrinks little by little until it becomes very small indeed. And here's where things get a bit ironic, because sometimes the stricter the control became, the more suspicious it looked. If a husband suddenly locked down his household, people would wonder why. If a woman disappeared from public view, people would assume the worst. So in trying to protect reputation, they often damaged it further, which is just a very human kind of problem. Let's just sit with that for a moment. A life shaped not by actions, but by perceptions. A reputation built over years, undone by a few quiet words, and a system that, once it starts doubting you, doesn't really stop. Now in some cases, the situation might stabilize. The whispers fade. A new scandal appears somewhere else. People get distracted. And Eleanor, if she's very lucky, is quietly absorbed back into normal life. A little more cautious, a little more withdrawn, but still intact. But not everyone is that lucky, because sometimes the whispers grow louder. They gain detail. They become stories. And once a story takes hold, it's much harder to dismiss. Maybe someone claims they saw her alone with someone she shouldn't have been with. Maybe a servant seeking favor decides to add their own version of events. Maybe a rival sees an opportunity. And suddenly, what was once vague starts to feel very specific. Very real, even if it isn't. And now, we're entering more dangerous territory, because once an accusation becomes formal, it's no longer just social. It becomes legal. And legal systems, especially in earlier periods, were not exactly designed to be fair. They were designed to maintain order. To protect property. To preserve hierarchy. And unfortunately, that didn't always align with truth. So Eleanor might find herself called to answer for something she didn't do, or something she can't prove she didn't do, which, again, is a very frustrating position to be in. And here's another quiet detail. Evidence, as we understand it today, wasn't always required. Testimonies could be enough. Reputation could be enough. Even behavior, interpreted in the wrong way, could be enough. And since expectations for women were so rigid, it didn't take much to appear suspicious at this point. Her options are limited. She can deny it. Of course. But denial, especially from someone already under suspicion, isn't always convincing. She can try to gather support. Friends. Family. Anyone willing to speak on her behalf. But support can be unreliable. People tend to protect themselves first. And then, there's the possibility that her husband simply decides. Without a trial. Without a formal process. Just decides that she's guilty. Or at least inconvenient enough to remove. Because in many cases, a husband had significant authority over his wife. He could separate from her, send her away, confine her. Or worse. All while maintaining the appearance of propriety. And this is where things start to feel very quiet and heavy. Because for Eleanor, there's no dramatic moment. No clear turning point. Just a slow realization that her life is no longer her own. That every action is being watched, every word weighed. Every silence interpreted. And it's exhausting. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in that slow, creeping way. Where each day feels a little smaller than the last. So let's just pause here for a moment and take a breath. Because from here, things don't necessarily get better. They just become more official. More structured. More permanent. And as we gently drift forward, we'll see what happens when suspicion turns into judgment, and when judgment turns into consequence. Not always dramatic. Not always immediate, but always quietly life-changing. So stay with me, and let's float just a little deeper into this world. So we left Eleanor in that uncomfortable space. Not quite condemned, but no longer safe. Just sort of existing in that quiet middle ground where everyone is watching, and no one is saying anything directly, which, in many ways, is worse. Because at least a clear accusation gives you something to respond to. This is just waiting. Now, eventually, in many of these cases, the waiting ends. Not with a dramatic announcement. No bells. No grand declarations. Just a shift, a subtle one, where the whispers stop being whispers. And start being treated like facts. Maybe her husband calls in a few trusted men. Local officials. Family allies. People whose opinions carry weight. Mostly because they all agree with each other. They sit together, maybe over a very calm, very serious meal, and they discuss, not loudly. Not emotionally. Just practically. Because that's how these things were often handled, like a problem, a situation to be resolved. And Eleanor? She's not in the room. Of course she isn't, because her perspective, while technically relevant, isn't really the priority. What matters is stability. Reputation. Control. And above all, avoiding embarrassment. So they go over what they know, which, as we've already established, might not be much. A few sightings, a few comments, a general sense that something is off. And that, historically, could be enough. Because once a group of influential people agrees that something is likely true, it tends to become officially true. Now, depending on the time and place, this might lead to an actual legal proceeding. Something that resembles a trial, although resembles is doing a lot of work here, because these weren't exactly the balanced, evidence-based trials we imagine today. They were guided, structured in a way that leaned heavily toward preserving order, rather than discovering truth. Eleanor might be brought forward, ask questions, not aggressively, not dramatically. Just calmly. Almost politely, which somehow makes it more unsettling, because the outcome often feels pre-decided. Where were you on this evening? Who were you speaking to? Why were you seen alone? Simple questions, but loaded ones, because every answer can be interpreted. Adjusted. Turned into something slightly more suspicious than it really is. And again, proving innocence in this kind of situation is extremely difficult. You're not just defending your actions. You're defending your character, your tone, your expression, even your silence. If she seems nervous, that's suspicious. If she seems calm, that might be seen as calculated. If she becomes emotional, that could be taken as guilt. If she remains composed, that might look like indifference. There's really no perfect way to respond, which is kind of the point. Now, sometimes there would be witnesses, servants. Neighbors. Anyone willing to speak, and their testimonies could vary wildly. Some might defend her. Quietly. Carefully. Without saying too much, because again, people protect themselves. Others might embellish, add details. Make their stories just a little more interesting, a little more useful, especially if they have something to gain. And then there's the husband. His role is complicated. Because technically, he's the wronged party, the one whose honor has been damaged, whose household has been disrupted. But he's also the one with the most power in this situation. So his opinion carries a lot of weight. If he believes she's guilty, that belief alone can shape the outcome. If he wants to make an example, things can escalate. If he wants to handle it quietly, it might stay contained. But either way, the balance is not equal. Not even close. Now let's just slowly move into what happens next, because this is where consequences begin to take shape. And interestingly, they don't always look the way you might expect. Not every accusation led to dramatic punishment. In fact, many didn't, because public scandal was messy. It drew attention, raised questions, and potentially exposed more problems than it solved. So often, the goal was to resolve things quietly. One common outcome: separation. Not necessarily a formal divorce, because that could be complicated, depending on the religious and legal system in place, but a kind of unofficial distancing. Eleanor might be sent away to a relative's home to a remote estate, somewhere out of sight and out of conversation, and on the surface, this could look almost merciful. No public shame, no harsh punishment, not just a quiet removal. But when you think about it, it's a kind of erasure, a life paused, a presence faded out. She loses her position, her daily life, her social connections, everything that once defined her becomes inaccessible, and she's left in a sort of suspended existence. Not fully disgraced, but not fully accepted either. Now in other cases, the consequences could be more structured, more formal, especially in places where religious courts were involved. Because adultery wasn't just a social issue. It was considered a moral offense, a sin, and that brought a different kind of authority into play. Church courts, for example, might handle these cases with a mix of moral judgment and procedural formality, which sounds reassuring, until you realize that their standards of proof were still quite flexible. They might require confession, encourage it, even gently, persistently, because a confession simplifies everything. It brings closure, restores order, and avoids prolonged uncertainty. But of course, not all confessions are freely given. Sometimes, they're the result of pressure, of exhaustion, of realizing that denying something endlessly isn't leading anywhere. And once a confession is obtained, well, that tends to seal things. Punishments in these contexts could vary. Sometimes it was public penance, standing before the community, admitting wrongdoing, expressing remorse, a kind of ritualized humiliation designed to restore moral balance. Other times, it involved restrictions, limitations on movement, on social interaction, on participation in community life. Again, not dramatic, but deeply limiting. And through all of this, there's a quiet pattern emerging, a kind of steady narrowing of options. Each step reducing what Eleanor can do, where she can go, who she can be. Now it's worth noting, men, even when accused of similar behavior, rarely face the same level of scrutiny, or consequence, which is not surprising, but still a little frustrating, because the system wasn't just about behavior, it was about control, about ensuring that lineage remained predictable, that property passed correctly, and that social order stayed intact. So the burden fell unevenly, heavily, and almost always in one direction. Let's just pause here again, because none of this is loud, none of it is fast, it's all very gradual, very procedural, which somehow makes it feel more inevitable. And for Eleanor, wherever she is now, whether she's been sent away or made to stay quietly in place, life continues, but differently, smaller, more watched, more careful. She learns to speak less, to move less, to exist in a way that doesn't draw attention, because attention hasn't served her well, and maybe, over time, things settle, people forget, or at least, they pretend to, because history has a way of moving on, even when individuals are left behind. But not every story ends in quiet fading. Some continue, some become more complicated, more public, more difficult to contain. And as we drift a little further, we'll see what happens when cases like this don't stay small, when they reach higher levels, involving people who can't simply be sent away. Because when royalty or nobility faces these accusations, the stakes don't just increase, they expand, touching politics. Power. And entire kingdoms. So stay with me, and let's slowly, gently move into that world next. So let's just gently drift upward for a moment, away from Eleanor and her quiet, shrinking world, and into something a bit larger, a bit more visible, a bit more complicated. Because when accusations of adultery reach the level of royalty, they don't just affect a household, they ripple outward into courts, into councils, into entire kingdoms that suddenly find themselves very interested in someone's private life. And unfortunately, the higher the status, the less likely things are to remain quiet, because royalty doesn't really have the luxury of disappearing discreetly. You can't exactly send a queen to a distant cottage and hope no one notices. People tend to notice when a queen vanishes. They ask questions, uncomfortable ones, and rulers, historically, were not huge fans of uncomfortable questions. So instead of quiet removal, these situations often became public. Or at least semi-public. Discussed behind heavy doors, but known well enough that everyone had an opinion, which, as we've learned, is never ideal. Let's imagine a royal figure for a moment. We'll call her Isabella, because that name carries just the right amount of elegance and underlying tension. Isabella is married into power. Her marriage isn't just a personal arrangement. It's a political one. An alliance, a statement, a carefully constructed piece of a much larger puzzle. And like many royal marriages, it may not be particularly happy. That's not unusual. In fact, it's almost expected. Because compatibility wasn't really the goal, stability was. So Isabella does her duty. She appears at court. She smiles when required. She produces heirs. Ideally. And she navigates a world where every movement, every glance, every conversation is observed. Not casually, but closely. Now imagine, in that environment, a rumor begins. Not a loud one. Not at first. Just a quiet suggestion that perhaps Isabella has grown fond of someone, a courtier, a nobleman, someone she sees often enough to raise just a little curiosity. And again, it doesn't take much, because in a royal court, people are always watching, always interpreting, always looking for patterns, even when there aren't any. Maybe she speaks to him more than others. Maybe they share a moment of laughter. Maybe, and this is often enough, someone decides they look too comfortable in each other's presence. And just like that, the idea begins to grow. Now, unlike Eleanor, Isabella cannot simply fade into the background. She is the background. Her presence is constant. Her actions visible. So the rumor spreads faster, reaches more ears, more influential ears. And eventually, it reaches the one person it absolutely cannot avoid, her husband, the king. Now kings, like husbands, do not enjoy feeling disrespected. But kings have an added complication. Their personal lives are tied directly to their authority. So an accusation like this isn't just embarrassing. It's destabilizing. Because if the queen is unfaithful, then the legitimacy of her children comes into question. And if that happens, well, now we're not just talking about a marriage. We're talking about succession. Inheritance. The future of the entire realm. So suddenly, what might have been a private issue becomes a public concern, a political concern. And that means it needs to be addressed. Not quietly, but carefully. The king can't ignore it. That would make him look weak. But he also can't act too quickly. That might create panic. Or worse, suggest that there's truth to the rumors. So what does he do? He investigates. Of course he does. Because nothing says calm and stable monarchy like a discreet internal inquiry into your wife's personal life. Trusted advisors are brought in. Evidence is quietly gathered. Servants are questioned. Movements are tracked. Not in a dramatic cloak and dagger way, but in a slow, methodical, slightly uncomfortable way. And Isabella? She likely notices. How could she not? The shift in tone, the extra attention, the subtle distancing. But again, there's very little she can do, because defending yourself against something that hasn't been formally stated is still incredibly difficult, even for a queen. Now, in some cases, these investigations would lead nowhere. No solid evidence. No clear wrongdoing. And the matter would be quietly dropped. Or at least officially dropped. But the suspicion, that doesn't always disappear. It lingers, changes the atmosphere, alters relationships, leaves a kind of invisible mark. But in other cases, the investigation finds something. Or at least enough to convince those in power that something has happened. And that's when things become much more serious. Because at this level, the consequences are not just personal, they are performative. They send a message. They reinforce authority. They remind everyone what happens when lines are crossed. So instead of quiet exile, we might see something more formal, a trial, a public accusation, a structured process that gives the appearance of fairness, while often moving toward a very specific outcome. Witnesses are called, testimonies are presented, details, sometimes vague, sometimes oddly specific, are discussed. And all of it unfolds in a setting where the result feels increasingly inevitable. And Isabella, despite her status, is not immune. In fact, her status makes it worse, because more is at stake. More needs to be proven. Or at least demonstrated. Now, we won't rush into outcomes just yet, because what's interesting here is the atmosphere. The slow shift from uncertainty to expectation, from rumor to narrative. People begin to talk as if it's already decided. As if the trial is just a formality, a step in a process that has already reached its conclusion. And that's something we've seen before. At lower levels. In smaller households. But here, it's amplified. Louder. More visible. And yet, still strangely quiet. Because even in these grand settings, there's a certain restraint, a controlled tone, a sense that everything must be handled with dignity, even when the situation itself is anything but dignified. Let's just pause here again, because we're approaching a point where outcomes begin to take shape, and they won't all look the same. Some will be quiet, some less so, but all of them will carry that same underlying theme. A system trying to maintain control, even if it means reshaping someone's life completely. So as we continue, we'll gently explore what those outcomes looked like, for queens, for noble women, for anyone whose story became too public to ignore. Stay with me, and let's keep drifting slowly forward. So, we've slowly made our way here, from whispers in dimly lit halls, to quiet interrogations, to full courtrooms where everything feels already decided. And now, we arrive at the part that people often expect to be dramatic. The ending. But history, especially this kind of history, doesn't always end with a loud moment. More often, it just settles. Let's return to Isabella for a moment. She's been watched, questioned, discussed, her life carefully examined by people who have already begun forming conclusions. And now, a decision has to be made, not just about her, but about what her situation means for the crown, for stability, for appearances. Because in royal life, appearances matter almost as much as reality. Sometimes more, if the court decides that she is guilty, or even just inconveniently suspicious, then something must be done. But what that something looks like varies in some cases. The outcome is surprisingly quiet, a kind of controlled resolution. Isabella might be removed from court, not dramatically, not publicly shamed in a grand spectacle, just relocated, perhaps to a distant residence, or a religious house, somewhere respectable enough to avoid scandal, but distant enough to avoid questions. And on paper, this might seem almost gentle. No shouting crowds, no harsh declarations, just a change in address, a quieter life. But when you look closer, it's a kind of disappearance, a gradual fading, her role, gone. Her influence, removed. Her name, spoken less and less over time. Until eventually, she becomes more of a memory than a presence, and that in many ways was one of the most common endings, not dramatic punishment, but quiet erasure. Now in other situations, the outcome was more formal. More structured, a public acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. This could involve a ceremonial separation, an annulment, a declaration that the marriage itself was no longer valid, which sounds simple, but carried enormous implications, because undoing a royal marriage was not just about two people. It was about alliances. Treaties, entire networks of power that had been built around that union. So even in ending it, there had to be care. Language had to be chosen carefully. Blame assigned in a way that preserved as much stability as possible. And again, this often meant that the woman carried the weight, because it was easier. Cleaner. More convenient. Now there were also cases where things became more severe. Where the need to make a statement outweighed the desire for quiet resolution. In those situations, punishments could be harsher, more visible, designed to reinforce authority. To remind everyone watching where the boundaries were. But even then, the tone wasn't always explosive. It was often controlled. Measured. Almost administrative. As if something deeply personal had been turned into a procedural task. And that's something we've seen throughout this entire journey. A kind of emotional distance, a tendency to treat human lives as elements in a larger system, things to be adjusted, rearranged, removed, if necessary. Now let's gently widen our view again, because while Isabella's story feels large, it's not unique. Across different times and places, women accused of adultery experienced variations of the same pattern. Suspicion, isolation, and then some form of removal. Sometimes it was social, a slow withdrawal from community life, a quiet shift where invitations stopped coming, conversations grew shorter, and presence became less welcome. Sometimes it was physical. Being sent away, relocated, placed in environments where interaction was limited and visibility was reduced. Sometimes it was legal, formal proceedings, official records, a documented version of events that may or may not have reflected reality, but no matter the form, the effect was often the same: a narrowing of life, a reduction of possibility, a quiet but lasting change. And perhaps one of the most striking things is how often these outcomes were accepted, not celebrated, not even necessarily agreed with, but accepted, because the system itself was rarely questioned. It was seen as necessary, as natural, as simply the way things worked. And for the women within it, there were very few ways to push back, very few opportunities to rewrite the narrative. So most didn't. They adapted, adjusted, survived in whatever way they could, even if that meant becoming smaller, quieter, less visible, and over time, their stories faded, not completely, but enough that they became background. Footnotes. Occasional mentions and records that focused more on outcomes than experiences, which is why, when we look back now, there's a certain stillness to these histories, a sense of lives that moved quietly through very loud systems. So let's just rest here for a moment. At the end of this slow drift, we began with a whisper, a small, almost harmless suggestion, and we followed it. As it grew, as it shaped perceptions, as it turned into something more solid, more consequential, and along the way, we saw how fragile reputation could be. How quickly it could shift, and how difficult it was to recover once it did. Not because of one action, but because of an entire structure built around control, around certainty, around the need to keep things in their proper place. And in that structure, women accused of adultery often became examples. Lessons. Quiet reminders of what could happen if boundaries were even suspected to be crossed. Not always through loud punishment, but through something softer. More subtle. And in many ways, more enduring. A life made smaller, a voice made quieter, a presence gently removed. And as we let that thought settle, you could almost feel the stillness of it, the slow, steady way these stories unfold, and then fade. So if your eyes are getting a little heavy now, that's perfectly fine, because history, like this, doesn't need a dramatic ending, it just quiets down. And somewhere in a distant room, a door closes softly, a conversation ends, a name is spoken one last time, and then less often after that, and the world moves on, slowly, quietly, as it always does. Falconers, oddly enough, lived in a world where silence mattered more than speech. Not because they were monks, not because they were shy, but because the creatures they worked with, hawks, falcons, eagles, had absolutely no patience for human nonsense. And kings, well, kings had even less, so the falconer stood somewhere in between. Not quite noble, not quite servant. A man trusted with something fragile, expensive, and occasionally violent. Which, if you think about it, is also how you'd describe most medieval princes, but we'll get to them later. For now, picture a morning before sunrise. The air is cold, damp, a little bit miserable. The kind of cold that quietly seeps into your bones without making a fuss about it. And there, already awake, is the falconer. Of course he is. Because falcons do not wait for you to feel rested. They do not care if you slept badly. They do not care if the king stayed up all night drinking wine and making poor political decisions. The bird is hungry, the bird is alert, and the bird expects perfection. So the falconer begins his day. He checks the jesses, those thin leather straps tied to the bird's legs. He inspects the hood, making sure it fits snugly, not too tight, not too loose. A badly fitted hood could turn a calm falcon into a feathery projectile of panic. And that's not ideal. Not when the king is watching. Because falconry, you see, wasn't just a hobby. It was a performance. A very slow, very elegant performance where everything looked effortless, while actually requiring absurd levels of control. The king would ride out, surrounded by courtiers trying to look important. And somewhere nearby, slightly behind, slightly to the side, would be the falconer. Never in front, never too visible, but always essential. He carried the bird on his gloved fist. A thick glove, because talons are not gentle. And the bird, hooded, calm, dignified, looked like a symbol of power, which it was, but only because the falconer had spent months, sometimes years, convincing it not to fly away forever. Let's pause on that for a moment. Imagine trying to train a creature that can leave you at any second and never come back. No leash, no cage, no emotional attachment in the way humans understand it. Just trust, carefully built, easily broken. That was the falconer's real skill. Not shouting commands. Not showing dominance, but creating a strange, delicate partnership. And if he failed, well, the bird didn't sulk. It simply vanished into the sky, which in a royal setting was not just embarrassing, it was dangerous, because that bird likely cost more than the falconer's entire life savings. And kings, as history repeatedly shows us, were not known for their calm reactions to financial disappointment. So yes, there was pressure. A quiet, constant pressure. Now let's drift a little closer to the bird itself. Falcons were not pets. Not really. They were aristocrats. Each species had its own status, its own social ranking, if you will. A peregrine falcon might be suitable for a knight, a goshawk for a lady, but the king required something rarer, something more impressive, perhaps a gerfalcon, large, pale, almost ghost-like in flight, and incredibly difficult to train, which naturally made it perfect for royal use, because nothing says I am powerful quite like choosing the most inconvenient option. The falconer, of course, had no say in this. He simply received the bird and began the long process of taming it, slowly, patiently, with methods that today might seem unusual. He would keep the bird awake for extended periods, gently encouraging it to rely on him. He would feed it carefully measured portions of meat, building association, routine, and eventually trust. And during this process, he spent more time with the bird than with other humans. Which explains a lot. If we're being honest, falconers were often a bit apart from everyone else, not quite isolated, but not entirely included either. They didn't sit at grand feasts. They didn't gossip with courtiers. They didn't involve themselves in political schemes, mostly because they were too busy making sure a bird didn't decide to fly into the nearest forest and start a new life. A simpler ambition, really, but also a more achievable one. Now when the hunt finally came, and it always came, because kings needed entertainment, the falconer's role became even more delicate. He had to read the bird, not in a dramatic, mystical way, but in small, subtle signals. A shift in weight, a slight tension in the wings, a particular kind of stillness. And at the right moment, he would remove the hood. That moment mattered. Too early, and the bird might fly off aimlessly. Too late, and the opportunity would be lost. Timing, as always, was everything. The bird would launch, fast, precise, almost effortless in its grace, and the court would watch, because this was the point. The spectacle, the controlled display of nature under royal command. Except, it wasn't really under control, not completely, which is what made it so compelling. The falcon might miss. It might chase the wrong target. It might simply not return. And every time the falconer felt that quiet tension in his chest, because while the king might laugh off a failed hunt once, twice, maybe even 3 times, there were limits. There were always limits, and falconers knew them better than anyone. Let's gently shift now to their living conditions, because while they served kings, they did not live like them, not even close. Falconers often stayed near the mews, the place where birds were kept. A practical choice, really. Falcons needed care at all hours. Feeding, cleaning, monitoring. It wasn't glamorous. It smelled distinctly alive. And the falconer's hands were rarely clean. Always marked by leather, feathers, and the faint trace of raw meat. But there was a kind of quiet pride in it, a sense of mastery, because while nobles argued over land and titles, the falconer controlled something far more unpredictable, a creature of the sky, and he did it without shouting, without force, without spectacle. Just patience, relentless, quiet patience. Of course, this didn't make him immune to court politics. Nothing did. Falconers could rise in status if they proved exceptional. A trusted falconer might gain the king's ear, not as an advisor, but as a reliable presence. Someone who understood routine, discipline, consistency. Qualities that, frankly, were often in short supply among royalty. But this closeness also came with risk, because being near a king meant being noticed. And being noticed meant being vulnerable. If something went wrong, a lost bird, a failed hunt, an accident, the falconer could quickly go from trusted servant to convenient scapegoat. It's a familiar pattern. History loves repeating it. Now, let's linger for a moment on the emotional side of this life, because it's easy to imagine falconers as purely practical men, focused, detached, but they weren't. Not entirely. They formed bonds with their birds, not in the way you might bond with a dog or a cat. There was no affection returned in the same way, no wagging tails or purring comfort, but there was recognition. A kind of mutual understanding. The bird knew the falconer, trusted him in its own way, returned to him after flight, accepted food from his hand. And in a world where most relationships were built on hierarchy and obligation, that kind of connection was rare, even if it came with talons. So yes, falconers cared. Quietly, carefully, without making a show of it. Because showing too much attachment could be problematic. After all, the bird belonged to the king. Always. No matter who trained it, no matter who cared for it, no matter who woke before dawn every single day to keep it alive and steady. Ownership, like everything else in royal life, was very clear, and not always fair. But fairness wasn't really the point, was it? It never is. So the falconer continued, day after day, season after season, training, watching, waiting. Living in that strange space between control and chaos. Between earth and sky. And as the court moved around him, full of noise, ambition, and endless small dramas, the falconer remained steady, a quiet figure with a bird on his arm. A man who understood that some things could never truly be owned, only guided, only trusted, only gently persuaded to return. And if that sounds like a metaphor for dealing with kings, well, it probably is. Let's drift onward. Because this world only gets stranger from here. There is something quietly amusing about the fact that kings' men who could command armies, redraw borders, and start wars over minor insults would become deeply, personally invested in the behavior of a bird. And not just any bird. A bird that, at any moment, could simply decide. No. No to flying. No to hunting. No to returning. Which, if you think about it, is a bold stance when your employer is the most powerful person in the kingdom. But falcons did not recognize power the way humans did. They did not care about crowns. They did not care about titles. And they certainly did not care about royal expectations. So when a king rode out for a hunt, expecting a flawless display of control and elegance, he was, in a way, placing his pride in the hands of a creature that could be distracted by a particularly interesting patch of sky. This is where the falconer's job became delicate, because it wasn't just about training the bird. It was about managing the king, carefully, subtly, without ever making it obvious. If a bird failed during a hunt, the falconer could not simply say, "Well, your majesty, that's nature." That would be unwise. Instead, he would offer explanations, gentle ones, acceptable ones. Perhaps the wind was wrong. Perhaps the prey was unusually evasive. Perhaps the bird was conserving energy. Yes, that sounded respectable. Kings liked respectable explanations. They did not like being reminded that they were, essentially, trying to control something inherently uncontrollable. So the falconer became a translator, not of language, but of expectation. He softened reality just enough to keep things smooth. And in return, he avoided becoming the subject of royal frustration. A fair trade, really. Now, let's linger on the birds themselves again. Because their personalities, yes, personalities played a surprisingly large role in all of this. Not all falcons were equal. Some were focused, driven, almost professional. Others were not. Some were easily distracted. Some were stubborn. Some had what we might politely call selective cooperation, and the falconer had to work with whatever he was given. Imagine being handed a bird with the attention span of a bored nobleman and being told, "Make this impressive." No pressure. And yet, somehow, they managed. Through routine, through patience, through an almost absurd level of observation. They learned the bird's moods, its preferences, its quirks. They knew when it was ready, when it wasn't, when it might decide to behave, and when it absolutely would not. And this knowledge was everything, because in the presence of a king, uncertainty was dangerous, not in a dramatic, immediate sense, but in a slow, creeping way. A falconer who consistently delivered smooth, successful hunts became valuable. Reliable. Trusted. But one who produced inconsistency, well, that was a problem. And problems, in royal courts, were often solved by removing them. Sometimes quietly, sometimes not. So the falconer aimed for predictability in a world that refused to be predictable, which is, frankly, a bit of a paradox. But then again, so is most of history. Let's float gently into the social dynamics of the court, because while falconers were not nobles, they were not invisible either. They occupied a curious middle space, too skilled to ignore, too practical to fully belong. They might be summoned by the king directly, spoken to, even relied upon, but they would not dine at the high table. They would not be included in grand discussions. They were useful, and usefulness, while appreciated, does not always translate to respect. At least, not the kind that comes with comfort. Still, some falconers managed to carve out a quiet kind of influence. A well-timed word, a subtle observation, a moment of shared routine with the king. These small interactions added up. and over time, a falconer might become familiar, not a friend. That would be too much. But not a stranger either. And in a court full of ambition and pretense, familiarity could be surprisingly powerful. It meant stability. It meant predictability. Two things kings often claimed to value, while consistently living without them. Now, let's talk about something slightly less poetic. Money. Because falconry was not cheap. Not even remotely. The birds themselves were expensive, rare, difficult to acquire. Some were imported from distant lands, carried across harsh terrain, carefully transported to ensure they arrived alive and reasonably cooperative. And once they arrived, the costs continued. Food, equipment, housing, care. All of it added up. And who managed these resources? The falconer, which meant he was not just a trainer, but also a caretaker, a planner, and occasionally, a quiet accountant. He had to ensure that everything was maintained without waste, that the birds were fed properly, but not excessively, that equipment was repaired, not constantly replaced. Because while kings enjoyed spending money, they also enjoyed questioning where it went, especially if something went wrong. And when something went wrong, the falconer needed answers. Calm, reasonable, well-structured answers, delivered without hesitation, because hesitation suggested doubt, and doubt was not comforting. So the falconer learned to speak carefully. To present information in a way that reassured, rather than challenged. Another subtle skill. Another quiet performance. Now let's drift into a slightly more personal space. The falconer's relationship with time. Because his life did not follow the rhythms of the court. It followed the rhythms of the birds. Early mornings, consistent routines, seasonal patterns. While nobles might stay up late, feasting and entertaining, the falconer often rose before dawn. While the court shifted with political winds, the falconer remained grounded in repetition. There was something almost meditative about it. A steady cycle of care and attention. A life shaped not by ambition, but by necessity. And in a strange way, this made the falconer more stable than many of the people he served. Less dramatic. Less reactive. Less chaotic, which, again, is mildly ironic, because he worked with creatures that could vanish into the sky at any moment. Now, of course, not everything was calm and controlled. There were accidents. There were injuries. Falcons are not gentle. Their talons are sharp. Their beaks are strong. Their instincts are direct. A distracted falconer could quickly find himself bleeding, not fatally usually, but enough to remind him that this was not a soft profession. And yet, he continued, because this was his world, a world of feathers and leather, of quiet mornings and tense hunts, of small successes and carefully avoided failures. And through it all, the king remained at the center, watching, expecting, occasionally appreciating, but never fully understanding the effort behind it all. Because from the outside, falconry looked simple. A bird flies, a bird returns, a king is pleased. But beneath that simplicity was a constant, careful balancing act. One mistake away from embarrassment, one misjudgment away from consequence. And the falconer walked that line every single day. Without applause. Without recognition. Just steady, quiet competence, which, in the grand, noisy chaos of royal life, might have been the rarest skill of all. Let's keep drifting. Because the deeper we go, the more this strange, quiet profession begins to reveal itself. There is a particular kind of patience required to train a falcon. Not the kind people talk about in grand speeches. Not the kind associated with wisdom or calm enlightenment. No, this is a quieter patience. A slightly tired patience. The kind that comes from repeating the same small action, again and again, until eventually something clicks, or doesn't. Because falcons, as it turns out, are not especially concerned with human timelines. You can spend weeks, months, even building trust. Carefully feeding, gently handling, establishing routine. Only for the bird to wake up one morning and decide that today is a day for chaos. And there's nothing you can do about it. Which is why the falconer learns early on that control is an illusion. A useful illusion, certainly, one that keeps kings entertained and court life running smoothly. But still an illusion. What the falconer really does is negotiate. Every single day. He offers food, consistency, safety. And in return, the bird offers cooperation. Sometimes. It's a delicate arrangement, one that requires constant adjustment. Now, imagine doing all of this under the quiet pressure of royal expectation. Because while the falconer is building this fragile relationship, the king is waiting. Not impatiently, perhaps. Kings rarely admit to impatience, but the expectation is there. A new bird arrives. And the question is always the same: when will it be ready? A simple question, with a complicated answer. Because ready is not a fixed state. It's a moment, a condition. A temporary alignment of trust, instinct, and timing. But explaining that to a king is difficult. So the falconer nods, offers a measured estimate, and returns to his work, slowly, quietly, carefully. Let's drift into the training itself, because this is where things become almost oddly intimate. The falconer spends hours with the bird. Not speaking much, not making sudden movements, just being present. He allows the bird to grow accustomed to him, to his scent, his movements, his rhythm. At first, the bird resists. Of course it does. It is a creature designed for freedom, for open skies and distant horizons. Being held on a gloved hand is not its preferred lifestyle. So it struggles. It flaps, it pulls, it tests the limits of the JESS. And the falconer does not react. Not dramatically anyway. He remains steady, because reacting too strongly would only reinforce the bird's resistance. So he waits, and waits, and waits. Until eventually, the bird becomes still. Not because it has been defeated, but because it has decided temporarily that this situation is acceptable. That's the first step. Not obedience, acceptance. A subtle difference, but an important one. From there, the falconer begins to introduce small routines, feeding at consistent times, handling the bird in predictable ways, gradually increasing its exposure to the outside world. Each step is small, almost unnoticeable, but together, they build something fragile and complex. Trust. Or something close to it. Now, here's where things get slightly more precarious. The first flight. This is the moment every falconer approaches with a mix of quiet hope and very real anxiety. Because up until now, the bird has been restrained. Controlled. But the first flight changes everything. The jesses are loosened. The bird is given space. And for the first time, it has a choice. Stay or leave. A simple choice, with significant consequences. The falconer prepares carefully. He chooses the location, the timing, the conditions. Everything must be just right. Not too windy, not too distracting, not too open, because too many variables increase the risk, and risk, in this moment, is not welcome. He removes the hood. The bird blinks, adjusts. Takes in the world around it. And then, it flies. There is always a brief moment of silence. A pause. As the falconer watches the bird rise into the air. Higher, further. And for a second, there's a quiet fear. What if it doesn't come back? Because it doesn't have to. Nothing is physically forcing it to return. This is the moment where all that careful training is tested, not through force, but through choice. So the falconer waits. He does not shout. He does not panic. He simply waits. And eventually, the bird circles. Once, twice. And then slowly, it returns, landing back on the gloved hand. Not because it must, but because it chooses to. And in that moment, the falconer allows himself a small, quiet sense of relief. Not celebration. That would be premature. But relief. Because the process has begun. Now, of course, not every first flight goes this smoothly. Sometimes the bird hesitates. Sometimes it flies too far. And sometimes it doesn't come back. At least, not immediately. And this is where things become complicated. Because a lost bird is not just an inconvenience. It is a problem. A visible problem. One that raises questions. Where did it go? Why did it leave? When will it return? And the falconer must have answers, or at least he must appear to dot in reality. There's often very little he can do in the moment. He can search, he can call, he can wait, but ultimately the bird decides, which is not a comforting reality in a royal environment. So the falconer develops another skill. Composure, the ability to remain calm, even when things are quietly going wrong. Because panic does not help. It only draws attention. And attention, in this case, is not desirable. Eventually, most birds do return, drawn by hunger, by familiarity, by routine, but the time it takes can vary. Hours, days, occasionally longer, and during that time, the falconer lives in a state of quiet tension. Not dramatic, not overwhelming. Just persistent, a low, steady awareness that something important is missing and needs to come back. Now let's gently shift to the king's perspective, because from where he sits, quite literally on a horse, surrounded by attendants, the process looks very different. He sees the final result, the flight, the hunt, the return. He does not see the hours of waiting, the careful adjustments, the small repeated efforts. He sees success or failure, nothing in between, which again adds a certain pressure to the falconer's work, because his entire profession is built on the in-between, the gradual progress, the subtle changes, the quiet improvements, things that are difficult to display in a single moment, but essential to everything. So the falconer learns to bridge that gap. To present his work in a way that aligns with royal expectation. To create the appearance of simplicity, while managing underlying complexity. It's almost theatrical, except the audience has the power to change your life, which raises the stakes slightly. Now, through all of this, the falconer remains consistent. Steady. Present. He does not rush the process, because rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes, as we've gently established, are not ideal. Instead, he works at the bird's pace, which is not always convenient, but is always necessary. And over time, this slow, patient approach produces results. A bird that flies when expected, returns when called, performs reliably. Not perfectly, but reliably. And in the unpredictable world of royal life, reliability is surprisingly valuable. So the falconer continues. Day after day. Flight after flight. Small adjustments. Quiet observations. Building something that exists only as long as it is maintained. A fragile balance. Between freedom and control. Between instinct and routine. Between sky and hand. And if that balance sounds difficult to maintain, well, it is. But that, after all, is the falconer's entire life. Let's drift a little further, because this balance doesn't just apply to birds. It applies to everything around them. Over time, something curious happens to a falconer, not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, almost quietly. He begins to resemble the birds he works with. Not physically, of course, but in temperament. In rhythm. In the way he moves through the world. Because when your entire life revolves around creatures that demand calm, precision, and patience, you either adapt or you fail. And falconers, by necessity, adapted. They learn to keep their emotions steady. Absent, just controlled. A sudden burst of anger could startle a bird. A careless movement could undo weeks of trust. A moment of distraction could lead to loss. So the falconer became measured. Deliberate. Almost quiet in his own existence, which, in a royal court filled with loud personalities and endless displays of importance, made him something of an anomaly. He did not need to prove himself constantly. He simply did the work. And the work, when done well, spoke for him, not loudly, but clearly enough. Now, let's drift into the later years of a falconer's life, because this is where things become softer. Less about proving skill, and more about maintaining it. An experienced falconer did not rush. He had already learned what impatience could cost. So he moved with a kind of quiet confidence. He knew when a bird was ready, and when it wasn't. He knew when to wait, and when to act, And perhaps most importantly, he knew when to accept that some things could not be controlled. A younger falconer might push, try to force progress, attempt to impress an older one. Simply observed, adjusted, allowed the process to unfold. There's a certain calm in that, a kind of acceptance, resignation, just understanding. Now, of course, time does not pause for anyone. Not for kings. Not for falconers. And certainly not for birds. Falcons age, their speed slows, their precision softens. And eventually, they are no longer suitable for the hunt. At this point, the falconer faces a quiet shift. The bird he has trained, cared for, relied upon, is no longer central to his work. And yet, it is still there, still familiar, still part of his daily routine. So he adjusts again. Perhaps the bird is kept for breeding. Perhaps it is simply maintained, cared for without expectation. But the dynamic changes. Less performance, more presence. And the falconer, who has spent years building something based on action and response, now exists in a slower space. A quieter one. It's not sad, exactly. Just different. Now let's gently widen the lens one final time. Because the falconer's life, while specific, reflects something broader, something quietly human. He lives in service to something he cannot fully control. He invests time, effort, care into a relationship that depends on trust rather than ownership. He navigates expectations that are not always realistic, and he does all of this without seeking recognition, without demanding attention, just consistently. There's something almost philosophical about it. Though, of course, no one at the time would have described it that way. They would have simply said, he works with birds, which is true, but also not the whole story. Because in working with those birds, the falconer learns something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. That control is temporary, that trust is fragile, and that sometimes the best you can do is create the conditions for something to return. And hope that it does. Now, let's settle into the final moments of this world. The hunt is over. The king is satisfied, at least for today. The court begins to drift away. Conversations already shifting to other matters, politics, alliances, small, quiet rivalries that will continue long after the memory of the hunt fades. And the falconer remains. Of course he does. He always remains a little longer. He removes the hood from the bird, then replaces it gently, checks the jesses, adjusts the glove. Small, practiced movements. There is no audience now, no expectation, just routine. And in that routine, there is a kind of peace, a rare one, because for all the noise of the court, all the shifting dynamics and fragile egos, this part remains unchanged. The bird, the hand, the quiet understanding between them, it's not dramatic, it's not grand, but it is steady. And perhaps that is what kept falconers in their role for so long. Not ambition, not power, but the quiet satisfaction of something that worked. Something that held together, even when everything else felt uncertain. So as the light fades, and the day settles into evening, the falconer walks back toward the mews. Steps slow, unhurried. The bird rests calmly on his arm, not because it has been conquered, but because, for now, it chooses to stay. And tomorrow, the process will begin again. The same careful balance, the same quiet negotiations, the same delicate dance between freedom and return. And the falconer will be there. As he always has been. Not at the center of history. Not remembered in grand stories. But present. Consistent. A quiet figure in the background of royal life, holding something wild, and somehow keeping it close. And with that, we let the scene fade. Softly. Without urgency. Just the faint sound of wings settling. And a world that continues, exactly as it always has. Somewhere in a quiet stone chamber, a girl is being discussed. Not present. Of course, that would be unnecessary. Instead, she exists as a set of useful details. Her age, her lineage. Her health. And most importantly, her potential. Because in the world of noble families, Daughters were not raised. They were arranged, carefully, strategically, sometimes years, decades, before they even understood what was happening. And this girl, let's call her something gentle, perhaps Eleanor, is already part of a conversation she cannot hear. A negotiation. Really. Her father sits across from another man. Perhaps older, perhaps equally calculating. They speak in calm, measured tones, discussing land, alliances, debts, and obligations, and occasionally, almost as an afterthought, they mention Eleanor. She's of good constitution. She will make a fine wife. She brings a respectable dowry. All very polite. All very detached. Because this is not about love. It is not even about compatibility. It is about usefulness. And Eleanor, currently somewhere down the hall, is likely doing something very unremarkable. Learning her letters, practicing her stitching. Trying not to spill ink on a piece of parchment. Completely unaware that her future is already being quietly sealed. Of course it is. Because waiting for her opinion would complicate things. And noble families did not enjoy complications. Now let's drift gently into Eleanor's early years. Because childhood for noble girls had a slightly different flavor. Not unhappy necessarily, but structured. Purposeful. From a young age, she is taught the things she will need to know. Not how to rule, not how to command, but how to exist correctly. She learns to sit properly. To speak softly. To listen more than she talks. And perhaps most importantly, to obey. Not in a harsh, dramatic way. Just consistently, because obedience in this world is not optional. It is expected, woven into daily life, like embroidery patterns and carefully practiced smiles. Now, there is a certain irony here, because while boys are often allowed a degree of chaos, running, shouting, occasionally making poor decisions that will later become amusing stories, girls, like Eleanor, are refined. Polished. Smooth into something presentable, something that can be offered when the time comes, and that time, as it turns out, arrives sooner than one might expect. Sometimes the engagement happens when she is still a child, 7, 8, 9 years old. An age where the idea of marriage is abstract at best, but the agreement is made anyway. Formalized. Recorded. Because from this point forward, Eleanor is no longer just a daughter. She is a future wife, a future alliance, a living connection between two families. And everything she does begins to reflect that. Her education becomes more focused. She learns about household management, social etiquette, religious duties. All the things that will make her suitable, which is a polite way of saying acceptable. Now, let's pause for a moment on the idea of suitability, because it's a word that appears often in these arrangements. A suitable match, a suitable bride, a suitable alliance. It sounds harmless. Almost reasonable. But beneath it lies a quiet pressure. To meet expectations. To fit a role that has already been defined. And Eleanor, whether she realizes it or not, is being shaped to fit that role. Carefully. Patiently. Without much room for deviation. Now, of course, not all noble girls reacted the same way. Some accepted their fate with quiet resignation. Others resisted, at least internally, though open resistance was rare. And not particularly encouraged. Because questioning an arranged marriage was not just a personal matter. It was a political one. A refusal could disrupt alliances, cause offense, even spark conflict, which is quite a heavy burden to place on someone who still struggles with handwriting. So most girls learn to adapt. To accept. To find small spaces of comfort within a structure they did not choose. Perhaps in friendships, perhaps in books, perhaps in the quiet moments between lessons. Now, as Eleanor grows older, the idea of marriage becomes less abstract. More real. More immediate. She begins to understand that this arrangement is not just a distant plan. It is her future. And with that realization comes a shift, subtle but noticeable. She becomes more aware of expectations, more conscious of her behavior, because now she is not just representing her family. She is preparing to join another, a family she may have never met, a household she has never seen, a husband she may only know through descriptions, which, as you can imagine, vary in accuracy. He is kind. He is strong. He is suitable. Again, that word. Always that word. But kindness, strength, suitability. These are subjective, and Eleanor has no way of verifying them. She can only trust, or perhaps hope. Now let's gently move toward the wedding itself, because despite everything, the negotiations, the expectations, the careful planning, the event is often grand, lavish, even a display of wealth, status, and alliance. Guests gather, music plays, food is served, and Eleanor, dressed in fine fabrics, becomes the center of attention. For a moment, at least, she walks through the ceremony, repeats the vows, performs the role she has been preparing for her entire life. And just like that, everything changes. She leaves her childhood home, her family, her familiar surroundings, and enters a new world. One where she is no longer a daughter, but a wife. And with that title comes a new set of expectations, new responsibilities, new pressures. Because now, her role is not just to exist correctly, but to produce heirs, stability, continuation, all very important things, all very serious. And Eleanor, who not long ago was practicing her stitching and trying not to spill ink, is now expected to navigate this entirely new reality, calmly, gracefully, without complaint. Of course, now let's take a quiet moment to consider the emotional side of this transition, because it's easy to focus on the structure, the system, the expectations. But beneath all of that, there is a person, a young woman, experiencing something deeply unfamiliar, possibly frightening, certainly overwhelming, and yet, she is expected to adapt quickly, to settle into her new role, to perform her duties without hesitation. There's very little space for uncertainty, very little room for hesitation. Because in this world, hesitation can be interpreted as weakness, and weakness is not desirable. So Eleanor adjusts. She learns her new household, observes its rhythms, understands its dynamics, and slowly, she finds her place within it. Not because she chose it, but because she must. And in doing so, she becomes part of the system that shaped her. Continuation of the same patterns, the same expectations, the same quiet negotiations. Now, let's not assume that all arranged marriages were miserable. Some, surprisingly, developed into something functional, even comfortable. Occasionally there was mutual respect, sometimes even a form of affection. But these outcomes were not guaranteed. They were incidental, a byproduct of proximity and time, not the goal. Because the goal, always, was alliance, stability. Advantage. And Eleanor, like so many others, was a means to that end. Not in a cruel, deliberate way, just a practical one, which, in some ways, makes it more unsettling. Because it was normal. Expected. Routine. Now, as we let this first part settle, we can begin to see the shape of things. A life planned before it begins. A role defined before it is understood. A path followed, not by choice, but by design. And Eleanor walks that path quietly, step by step, learning as she goes, adapting as she must, becoming, slowly, the person she was always meant to be, or at least, the person she was expected to be. And as we drift forward, we'll see what happens when expectation meets reality. Because those two things rarely align as neatly as people hope. By the time Eleanor arrives at her new home, something slightly uncomfortable becomes clear. She's expected to behave as though this place has always been hers, which is ambitious. Because in reality, everything about it is unfamiliar. The halls are different. The servants are different. Even the air feels different. And at the center of all this unfamiliarity is her husband, a man she may have met once. Briefly. Under very controlled circumstances. Perhaps he bowed. Perhaps he said something polite. Perhaps he looked fine. Which, in arranged marriage terms, is practically a glowing review. Now he stands before her not as a distant possibility, but as a permanent presence. And Eleanor, who has been trained her entire life to accept this moment gracefully, does exactly that. She smiles. Of course she does. Because what else is she supposed to do? Now let's take a closer look at this husband, because he too is a product of the same system. Raised with expectations, trained for a role, prepared to inherit responsibility. But unlike Eleanor, he has had options, a degree of freedom, not unlimited, of course, but enough to shape his personality in ways Eleanor was never quite allowed to. So he might be kind, or distant, or distracted. Or deeply invested in things that have nothing to do with his marriage. Hunting, politics, war, himself. And Eleanor must adapt to whichever version she receives. There is no exchange policy. No. Gentle, this isn't quite what I ordered. This is it. Now in the early days of their marriage, there is often a kind of polite awkwardness. Two people, bound together by law and expectation, attempting to establish a rhythm. They learn each other's habits. Carefully. Cautiously. Without pushing too hard. Because pushing too hard can lead to discomfort. And discomfort, in a household that relies on appearances, is something to be managed quietly. So they settle into routine. Meals at certain times. Conversations that stay within safe boundaries. Shared spaces that feel slightly formal. It's not cold. Not necessarily. But it isn't warm either. It's structured. Now, let's address something that everyone in this situation is very aware of, but rarely discusses openly. Children. Specifically, the expectation of children. Because for all the talk of alliances in households and proper behavior, the underlying goal remains the same: produce an heir. Preferably sooner rather than later. And Eleanor, who has just adjusted to a new home, a new husband, and an entirely new life, is now expected to fulfill this role. Calmly. Efficiently. Without hesitation. Of course, now the pressure here is quiet, but constant. No one is shouting. No one is making dramatic demands. But the expectation is present. In conversations. In glances. In the careful way people mention the future. And Eleanor understands. She has always understood. This was part of the arrangement. Now, how this unfolds depends on many things. Health, timing, luck. And, occasionally, compatibility, which, again, was not the primary concern during the arrangement process. So sometimes, things go smoothly. An heir is born. The household relaxes slightly. Eleanor's position becomes more secure. She is no longer just a wife. She is a mother, a valuable one, which in this world is a significant upgrade. But sometimes, things are less straightforward. Time passes, expectations remain unmet, and the quiet pressure begins to grow. Not loudly. Not openly. Just steadily. Questions begin to surface. Is everything as it should be? Is there a problem? And almost inevitably, the focus turns to Eleanor. Because in these situations, responsibility tends to settle in one direction. Now, this is where things can become emotionally complex. Because Eleanor may feel the weight of expectation. Without the power to control the outcome, she may try to meet those expectations, carefully, hopefully. But biology, as it turns out, does not respond well to pressure. And so the situation becomes uncertain. Which, in a structured environment, is deeply uncomfortable. Now, let's shift slightly to Eleanor's daily life within the household. Because while the larger expectations loom in the background, her day-to-day existence is filled with smaller, quieter tasks. Managing servants, overseeing the household, maintaining social relationships, all of which require attention. Care. And a certain level of diplomacy. Because a noble household is not just a home. It is a small, self-contained world. With its own hierarchies, its own tensions, its own quiet conflicts. And Eleanor, as its lady, must navigate all of this gracefully, which is easier said than done. Especially when you are still adjusting to your own place within it. Now, over time, something interesting begins to happen. Eleanor starts to develop a sense of control. Not over her marriage, not over the larger structure of her life, but over the details. The rhythms of the household, the behavior of the servants, the small decisions that shape daily life. And in these details, she finds agency. Limited, yes, but real. She learns who to trust. Who to rely on, who to avoid. And slowly, she builds a version of stability. Not perfect, but functional. Now, let's talk about the emotional landscape of her marriage, because while love was not the goal, it was not entirely impossible. Given time, proximity, and shared experience, some couples developed a kind of quiet companionship. Not dramatic. Not passionate, but steady. Predictable. And in a world full of uncertainty, predictability can feel comforting. So Eleanor and her husband may settle into something that works. They understand each other. They respect boundaries. They coexist effectively. And sometimes that is enough. Other times, in single quotes T. There may be distance. Misunderstanding. Even quiet resentment. But these things are rarely addressed directly, because addressing them would require confrontation, and confrontation is not encouraged. Not in a system that values order above all else. So emotions are managed. Contained. Folded neatly into the structure of daily life. Now, let's gently explore another layer. Family. Because Eleanor's marriage is not just between two individuals. It is between two families. And those families remain involved. In subtle ways, through visits, through letters, through expectations that never quite disappear. So Eleanor is not just adjusting to her husband. She's adjusting to an entire network of relationships. Each with its own dynamics, its own pressures, its own opinions. And navigating this network requires skill, careful observation, and a willingness to adapt. Which by now, Eleanor has in abundance. Now, as time passes, the initial shock of change begins to fade. The unfamiliar becomes familiar. The structured becomes routine. And Eleanor's life, once entirely dictated by arrangement, begins to feel normal. Not because it has changed, but because she has adapted to its rhythms, learned its patterns, accepted its limitations. And within those limitations, she has carved out a space for herself. A quiet, steady presence. Not dramatic. Not revolutionary, but real. And perhaps that is the most telling part of all this. Because arranged marriages, for all their structure and expectation, were not static. They evolved. Not through grand gestures, but through small, daily adjustments, through patience, through resilience. Through the quiet determination to make something livable. And Eleanor, like so many others, becomes skilled at this. Not because she chose it, but because she had to. Now as we let this part settle, we begin to see the shape of her life more clearly, not as a single event, but as an ongoing process, a continuous balancing act between expectation and reality, between duty and adaptation. Between what was planned and what actually unfolds. And as we drift forward, we'll see how this balance holds up over time. Because time, as it tends to do, has a way of revealing things. Slowly. Quietly. Without much warning. At some point, usually not marked by any particular day, Eleanor realizes something slightly unsettling. This is her life now, not temporarily, not until something changes. Indefinitely. And that realization doesn't arrive with drama. There's no moment where she gasps and drops a goblet. It's quieter than that. It settles in slowly, like the way evening light fades without asking permission. She wakes up one morning, and everything feels familiar. The same walls, the same routines, the same carefully measured conversations. And instead of feeling strange, it just feels normal. Which is, in its own way, the most surprising part. Because humans, as it turns out, are very good at adjusting to things they didn't choose, especially when there isn't another option. Now by this stage, Eleanor has learned the rhythms of her household. She knows which servant can be trusted to follow instructions, and which one needs to be gently reminded. She understands when to speak, and when silence is the safer choice. She has, in a very quiet way, become competent, which, in a noble household, is a kind of power, not loud power, Not the kind that changes laws or commands armies, but the kind that keeps things functioning. Meals appear on time. Guests are received properly. The household runs without visible friction. And Eleanor is at the center of that. Not visibly, but undeniably. Now, let's gently step into something that is rarely discussed openly, but always present. Loneliness. Because even in a large household, surrounded by people, Eleanor can feel alone. Not constantly. Not overwhelmingly. Just occasionally. In the quiet moments. Late in the evening. Early in the morning. In the space between responsibilities. Because while she is surrounded by others, very few of those relationships are equal. Servants rely on her. Family observes her. Her husband shares her space, but not always her thoughts. And so, there are moments where Eleanor exists in a kind of emotional middle ground. Not unhappy, but not entirely understood either. Now, she may find ways to manage this. Small, personal comforts. Perhaps she reads. Perhaps she writes letters, carefully worded, of course to family members she rarely sees. Perhaps she forms quiet friendships within the household. Other women. Ladies in waiting. Companions. People who understand the structure. Because they are also part of it. And in these relationships, there is a kind of ease, a shared understanding. No need for explanation. Just mutual recognition. Now, let's talk about expectations again. Because they do not disappear over time. They simply shift. If Eleanor has produced children, the focus moves to raising them. Properly. Carefully. According to the same structured principles that shaped her. And here, something interesting happens. Eleanor becomes both participant and enforcer. She teaches her daughters the same lessons she learned. How to behave, how to speak. How to exist within the system. And there may be moments, small fleeting moments, where she hesitates, where she considers something different. But those moments pass, because the system is larger than any one person. And Eleanor, having adapted to it, now helps maintain it. Not out of cruelty, not out of indifference, but out of practicality. Because in this world, deviation carries risk, and risk is rarely rewarded. Now, if Eleanor does not have children, or if her children do not survive, the situation becomes more complicated. The quiet pressure returns, sharper this time, more persistent. There may be suggestions, gentle at first, then less so. Perhaps her husband considers alternatives, not necessarily replacing her entirely, but finding other ways to ensure an heir. And Eleanor must navigate this carefully. With composure, with dignity. Because her position, while stable on the surface, is not entirely secure. It depends on outcomes, on expectations being met. And when those expectations are uncertain, so is everything else. Now, let's drift slightly toward Eleanor's relationship with her husband over time. Because familiarity does not always lead to closeness. Sometimes, it leads to distance, a quiet, comfortable distance. They understand each other's habits. They respect boundaries. They coexist without conflict. And in some cases, this is considered successful. No arguments. No scandals. No disruptions. Just calm. Other times, the distance feels heavier. Less comfortable. More like two people moving through the same space, without truly connecting. But again, this is rarely addressed directly, because addressing it would require vulnerability. And vulnerability is not something the system encouraged. So emotions remain contained. Managed. Folded neatly into routine. Now, let's take a moment to consider Eleanor's sense of identity, because over time, it becomes intertwined with her role. She is no longer just Eleanor. She is a wife, a lady, perhaps a mother, and these roles define her, shape her daily life, guide her decisions, which raises a quiet question. Who is she beyond those roles? And the answer is unclear. Not because she lacks personality, but because there has been very little space to explore it. Her path was defined early. Her choices were limited, and her identity grew within those boundaries, which is not uncommon, but it does mean that much of who she is exists in relation to others. To her husband, To her family. To her household. Now, this is not necessarily tragic. It's simply structured. But it does create moments of quiet reflection, where Eleanor might wonder briefly, gently, what life would have been like if things were different. Not dramatically different, just slightly. A different household, a different husband, a different set of expectations. But those thoughts do not linger, because they serve no practical purpose. And Eleanor by now is very practical. Now, let's gently move toward the later stages of her life. Because time, as it always does, continues. Her children grow. Her responsibilities shift. She may gain more authority within the household, more influence, more respect. Because experience in this world carries weight. And Eleanor, having navigated years of expectation and adaptation, becomes established, a steady presence, someone who understands how things work, someone others look to for guidance. And in this role, she may find a sense of fulfillment. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Just steady. A quiet satisfaction in having managed what was given to her. In having maintained stability. In having fulfilled her role competently. Now as we let this part settle, we can see the full shape of Eleanor's life. Not as a story of rebellion or transformation, but as a story of adaptation. Of quiet endurance. Of finding balance within a system that was never designed to offer choice. And perhaps that is the most striking part. Because while the structure of arranged marriage may seem rigid, the people within it were not. They adjusted. They adapted. They found ways to live within the limits they were given. And Eleanor is no exception. She moves through her life with quiet strength. Not loud. Not celebrated, but real. And as we drift into the final part, we'll let that life settle into its later years. Softly. Without urgency. Just as it was lived. By the time Eleanor reaches her later years, something has shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. Almost gently. The urgency that once surrounded her life begins to fade. No more anxious glances about heirs. No more quiet pressure to prove herself. No more careful attempts to meet expectations that have already been met or quietly set aside. Instead, there is space, not complete freedom, but space. And for someone who has spent her entire life moving within structure, even a small amount of space feels noticeable. Her children, if she has them, are older now. Daughters are being prepared for the same path she once walked. Sons are stepping into roles of their own. Eleanor watches this with a kind of calm awareness, because she recognizes the pattern. Of course she does. She has lived it. She knows how it unfolds. The careful training, the quiet expectations, the inevitable arrangements. And perhaps, in small moments, she offers guidance. Not dramatic advice, not rebellious suggestions, just small adjustments. A softer tone here, a bit of patience there. Little things that might make the process slightly easier. Because while she cannot change the system, she can influence how it feels. And sometimes, that is enough. Now, her household sees her differently too. She is no longer the young bride trying to find her place. She is established. Recognized. A figure of quiet authority. Servants listen more carefully. Family members consult her more often. Because experience in this world carries weight. And Eleanor has accumulated years of it. Not through grand achievements, but through consistency, through endurance, through simply being there. Day after day. Year after year. Now let's gently look at her marriage one last time, because time has a way of softening things. Edges blur, expectations relax, and what once felt uncertain becomes familiar. Her husband, once a stranger, is now known. Not necessarily deeply understood, but predictable. Comfortable. In a quiet way. They may not share passionate conversations. They may not express affection openly. But there is an ease in their routine. A shared understanding of how things work. And sometimes, that is what remains when everything else settles. Not excitement, not romance, but stability. A calm coexistence. Now, there may also be moments of reflection, quiet ones, where Eleanor looks back on her life and considers what it has been. Not in a dramatic, regret-filled way, just thoughtfully. She remembers her childhood. The early lessons, the careful training, the moment her future was decided. She remembers her arrival at this household, the unfamiliarity, the quiet adjustments, the slow process of finding her place. And she sees the pattern. Clearly. Because distance has a way of clarifying things. Now, does she feel regret? Perhaps. In small, fleeting ways. Moments where she wonders, what if? What if she had chosen differently? What if she had been allowed to choose at all? But those thoughts do not linger, because they cannot change anything. And Eleanor, having lived within this system for so long, understands the value of focusing on what is, rather than what might have been. So she lets those thoughts pass, like clouds moving across a quiet sky. Present for a moment, then gone. Now let's talk about legacy. Because in a world built on lineage and continuity, legacy matters. Eleanor's legacy is not written in grand political decisions. Not recorded in dramatic events. It exists in quieter ways. In the children she raised. In the household she maintained. In the stability she preserved. It exists in the continuation of the same patterns. The same structures. The same expectations. And while that may not seem remarkable, it is exactly what the system required. Consistency. Reliability. Continuity. And Eleanor provided all of that. Without fanfare. Without recognition beyond her immediate world. But with quiet effectiveness. Now as her life slows, her days become softer. Less structured. Less demanding. She may spend more time in quiet spaces. Gardens. Chambers. Small corners of the household where the noise of daily activity fades. And in those spaces there is a kind of peace. Not perfect peace, but enough. Enough to rest. Enough to reflect. Enough to simply exist. Without constant expectation. And perhaps for the first time, Eleanor experiences something close to choice. Small choices. How to spend her time. Where to sit. What to think about. Simple things, but meaningful, because they are hers. Now, as we gently approach the end of her story, there is no dramatic conclusion, no grand final moment, just a quiet continuation. Because lives like Eleanor's do not end with spectacle. They end the same way they were lived. Steadily. Calmly. Without interruption. And that, in a way, feels appropriate. Because her life was never about dramatic change. It was about adaptation. About moving within a structure and finding ways to make it livable. And she did, with patience, with resilience, with a kind of quiet strength that rarely draws attention, but always leaves an impact. So as the years pass, and Eleanor becomes more memory than presence, the world around her continues. New arrangements are made, new daughters are prepared, new marriages are negotiated. The pattern repeats. As it always has, as it always will. And somewhere, in another quiet chamber, another girl is being discussed. Her future being shaped by voices she cannot hear. Her path being decided before she fully understands it. And she too will walk that path. Carefully, quietly, learning as she goes, adapting as she must. Just like Eleanor. And with that, we let the story settle. No urgency. No final statement. Just the soft understanding that some lives are not about choosing the path, but about learning how to walk it. In a quiet stone house, somewhere just far enough from the center of town to feel slightly forgotten, a woman sits alone. The fire is low, the room is still, and for the first time in many years, no one is telling her what to do, which sounds peaceful, until you realize why. Her husband is gone. Not dramatically. Not with a grand final speech or some poetic last words about legacy. Just gone. A fever, perhaps. A fall from a horse. A war that needed bodies more than it needed careful planning. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that he is no longer here. And she is still alive, which, in medieval Europe, creates a very specific kind of problem. Because a married woman had a place, a clear one, defined, structured, supported, at least in theory. But a widow is uncertain. And uncertainty, as we've seen before, is not something medieval society handled particularly well. Now, let's take a slow look at her situation. Before her husband's death, her identity was simple. She was his wife. That single role carried weight. It determined where she lived, what she did, how others treated her. It gave her position. Not power, exactly. But position. And position, in a structured society, is everything. Now that role is gone. And in its place, there is a question: what is she now? A widow, yes, but what does that actually mean? Well, it depends. Of course it does, because nothing in medieval life was ever as straightforward as it seemed. Let's start with property, because property is always a good place to start when trying to understand how people were treated. If her husband owned land, and if the marriage contract included provisions for her, she might receive a portion of it. This is often called a dower, a polite word for "you can stay," but only within limits. She might be allowed to live on part of the estate, to manage it, to draw income from it. But, and this is important, it is rarely full ownership. Not permanent. More like a temporary arrangement, a lifetime lease, if you will. And once she dies, the property returns to her husband's family, because naturally, it does. Now, this arrangement provides some stability. She has a place to live, a way to support herself, but it also keeps her contained, because her position is tied to the memory of her husband, not to her own independent standing. And that distinction matters. Now, if her husband did not leave behind land, or if the arrangements were less generous, things become more complicated. She might rely on family, her own family, if they are willing and able, or her husband's family, if they feel a sense of obligation, which is not guaranteed, because while sympathy exists, practicality often wins, and an extra person, especially one without clear economic value, is not always convenient. So she may find herself moving from one household to another, never entirely settled, always slightly dependent. Now, let's talk about something that quietly shapes all of this: reputation. Because a widow's behavior is observed. Carefully. She is expected to mourn. Of course. To dress appropriately. To behave with dignity. To show that she respected her husband. All very reasonable on the surface. But beneath that is a subtle expectation. She must not move on too quickly, because that would raise questions. Was she too eager? Too comfortable with his absence? And medieval society, as it turns out, had a talent for asking uncomfortable questions without offering helpful answers. So the widow learns to perform her grief, not falsely, but carefully. In a way that meets expectation. Not too much, not too little, just enough. Now, here's where things become quietly ironic, because while she is expected to mourn, she is also often expected to remarry. Eventually. Not immediately, but soon enough, because a widow, especially a young one, is seen as an opportunity, a second chance at alliance, a redistribution of property, a way to connect families once again. And so, after a suitable period of mourning, the conversations begin. Quietly. Carefully. Just like before, suitors may appear, or rather, proposals. Because once again, this is not about romance. It is about practicality. And the widow, who has already experienced one arranged marriage, may find herself back in the same position, being discussed. Evaluated. Considered. Now, the difference this time is experience. She is no longer a young girl. She understands the system. She knows what marriage entails, which gives her a slight advantage. Not complete control, but more awareness. More ability to navigate, and sometimes more say, depending on her circumstances. Because some widows, especially those with property or wealth, hold a certain degree of leverage. They can choose. To an extent. They can delay. They can negotiate, which is a subtle but important shift. Now, not all widows choose to remarry. Some remain, as they are. Managing their dower lands, living quietly, maintaining independence within limits, and this can be surprisingly stable. because without a husband, they are not under direct male authority in the same way. They answer to family, yes, to society, certainly, but day to day. They have space, a kind of autonomy that married women often did not, which is slightly ironic. Because the state of widowhood, while uncertain, can also be freeing. In small, controlled ways. Now, let's not assume this freedom is comfortable. It comes with risks. Without a husband, a woman is more vulnerable. Legally, socially, economically. She must navigate a world that is not designed for her independence, and she must do so carefully, because a misstep can have consequences. Now let's drift gently into the emotional side of all this, because beyond property and reputation, there's loss. Real loss, not performed, not structured. Just personal. She may have loved her husband, or at least grown used to him, shared years of routine. Of familiarity, and now that presence is gone, which creates a quiet absence, one that is not always visible, but always there. And yet, she does not have much time to dwell on it. Because life continues. Practical concerns remain. Decisions must be made. So grief becomes something she carries quietly, alongside everything else. Now, let's take a moment to consider age, because age changes everything. A young widow is seen differently from an older one. A young widow is desirable. Valuable. A potential bride once again. An older widow, less so. She is less likely to remarry, more likely to remain within the household. To take on a quieter role, perhaps helping raise grandchildren. Managing smaller aspects of daily life, existing on the edges of the main story, which is not necessarily negative. Just different. Now, as we let this first part settle, we begin to see the shape of widowhood, not as a single experience, but as a range of possibilities, some stable, some uncertain. All shaped by circumstance, and at the center of it all is a woman who has outlived the role she was given, who must now find a new one, within a system that prefers everything to be clearly defined. And as we drift forward, we'll see how these women navigated that uncertainty, because they did. Quietly. Carefully. And often quite skillfully. At some point, usually after the initial wave of condolences has faded and the household has settled into a new rhythm, the widow notices something subtle. No one is watching her quite as closely, not in the same way. The constant presence of a husband, the quiet authority that shaped every decision, is gone. And in its place, there is space. Not wide, open freedom. Let's not get carried away, but enough space to make choices, small ones, quiet ones, ones that, for the first time in years, belong to her. She can decide how the household runs, what gets purchased, which servants are kept, and which are gently encouraged to find work elsewhere. These are not dramatic powers, but they are hers. And for a woman who has spent most of her life following instructions, that can feel unexpectedly significant. Now, let's be clear. This independence is not universal. It depends heavily on her situation. If she has a dower, land, income, resources, then she has room to operate. If she does not, well, things become far less comfortable. But for those who do find themselves with some level of financial stability, widowhood can create a kind of quiet autonomy, a strange, almost accidental freedom. Because without a husband, there's no one to directly override her decisions. No one to step in and say, actually, we'll do it this way. And that absence changes things, not loudly, but consistently. Now, this shift does not go unnoticed. Other people begin to see her differently, not just as someone's former wife, but as a figure in her own right, a woman who manages property, who makes decisions, who controls resources. And in a world where power is often tied to land and money, that matters. It matters quite a lot, which brings us to something slightly uncomfortable. Attention. Because an independent widow is noticeable. She may receive visits. Not just from friends or family, but from individuals with interests. Some are polite, some are practical, some are very clearly evaluating her situation, her wealth, her status, her availability, because, once again, she represents opportunity, and opportunity tends to attract attention. Now, the widow, having already experienced one marriage, is often more cautious this time. She understands what is at stake. She knows how arrangements are made. She knows how quickly personal comfort can be set aside in favor of practical advantage. So she may hesitate, delay, consider her options more carefully, which, again, is a subtle form of control. Now, let's talk about remarriage in a bit more detail, because while it is often encouraged, it is not always desired. Some widows choose to remarry for stability, for companionship, for protection. And that decision can make sense, especially in a world where being alone carries risks. But others choose not to, and this choice, while possible, is not always understood. Because from the outside, remarriage seems logical, efficient. But for the widow, it may feel like returning to a structure she has just stepped out of. A structure where her autonomy is reduced. Where decisions are once again shared or overridden. And after experiencing even a small degree of independence, that can be difficult to accept. So she weighs her options. Carefully. Quietly. Without announcing her reasoning. Because explaining such decisions is not always welcome. Now, let's drift into another aspect of her life. Religion. Because medieval Europe, as you might expect, had a very clear relationship with faith, and widowhood often deepened that connection. Some widows turned toward religious life, not necessarily becoming nuns, though that did happen, but adopting a more devout routine, more prayer. More reflection, more time spent in quiet contemplation, partly out of genuine belief, partly because it aligned with expectations. A pious widow is respectable. Safe. Uncontroversial. Which, in a society that values order, is always appreciated. Now, some widows took this further. They entered convents, chose a life removed from the complexities of household management and social expectation. A structured life, certainly, but one that offered a different kind of stability, a different set of rules. And perhaps a different kind of peace. Though, of course, convent life had its own limitations. Because no system is entirely free of them. Now let's return to the widow who remains in the world, managing her household, navigating her independence. Because over time, she develops a reputation. People begin to recognize her capabilities. Her judgment, her ability to maintain stability, and this reputation can be valuable. She may be consulted on matters, asked for advice, respected in a quiet way, not loudly celebrated, but acknowledged. Which, for a woman in medieval society, is not insignificant. Now let's touch on something slightly more personal. Control over her own body. Because in marriage, a woman's role is often defined by expectation, particularly when it comes to producing children. But in widowhood, that expectation fades. She is no longer required to fulfill that role. No longer under pressure to produce heirs. And that absence of expectation creates a shift, a subtle one, but meaningful. She has more say over her own life, her own choices, even if those choices are still shaped by external factors. Now, this does not mean complete freedom. Far from it. But it does mean less obligation. And less obligation can feel like relief. Now, of course, not everything is calm and controlled. There are challenges. Disputes over property, conflicts with family members, legal complications. Because when a husband dies, the structure that held everything together shifts. And those shifts can create tension. Questions about inheritance, about rights, about who controls what. And the widow must navigate all of this, often without the authority she technically needs. So she relies on skill, on diplomacy, on careful negotiation, which by now she has developed quite well. Now let's take a moment to consider how others perceive her, because perception matters. A widow who is seen as respectable maintains her position, but one who is perceived as improper, well, that creates problems. She must dress appropriately, behave appropriately, Avoid situations that could invite gossip. Because gossip, in medieval society, is not harmless. It shapes reputation. And reputation shapes opportunity. So she moves carefully, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Now, as time continues, the widow settles into her role, not as someone's wife, but as herself, within limits, within structure, but still distinct. And that distinction is important, because it represents a shift, a movement from defined identity to something more flexible, more self-directed, even if only slightly. And as we let this part settle, we begin to see a different side of widowhood, not just uncertainty, not just vulnerability, but also possibility. Quiet, limited, carefully managed possibility. And as we drift forward, we'll see how this balance holds over time. Because like everything else in medieval life, it changes. Slowly. And not always in the ways one might expect. At some point, after the routines settle and the initial adjustments fade into something manageable, the widow begins to notice another shift. People are paying attention again, but not in the same way as before. Not as a wife, not as part of a couple. Now she is seen individually. And in medieval society, being seen individually, especially as a woman, comes with a certain level of complication. Because independence, while occasionally respected, is also suspicious. Not openly, of course. No one stands in the middle of the village square and declares, "We are uncomfortable with your autonomy." That would be far too honest. Instead, it appears in quieter ways. In conversations that pause when she enters the room. In glances that linger just a little too long. In the careful way people phrase their questions. Are you managing well on your own? Do you have assistance? Always polite. Always measured, but beneath it, curiosity. And curiosity, as we've gently learned, is rarely neutral. Now let's talk about vulnerability, because while widowhood can offer a degree of independence, it also removes a layer of protection. A husband, for all his authority, also served as a kind of shield, a presence that signaled stability. Control. Ownership, if we're being slightly blunt. Without that presence, the widow becomes accessible. Not physically, necessarily, but socially. Legally. Economically. And this accessibility can attract attention from people who see opportunity where others see circumstance. Neighbors might question boundaries. Distant relatives might express sudden interest in her well-being. Local officials might take a closer look at her property, her rights, her obligations. Nothing overtly aggressive, just persistent. A steady awareness that she is now operating without a buffer. Now, this does not mean she is defenseless. Far from it. By this stage, the widow has developed skills. Observation. Negotiation. A careful understanding of how to present herself. She knows when to agree and when to quietly resist. She knows how to maintain respectability, because respectability in this context is not just a social preference. It is a form of protection, a way of signaling that she understands the rules and intends to follow them. At least visibly. Now let's drift into something that is rarely discussed openly, but always present. Money. Because managing resources is one thing, keeping them is another. A widow with property must defend it, not dramatically, not through confrontation, but through careful documentation, through alliances, through an awareness of legal structures that were not always designed in her favor. She may rely on advisors, trusted individuals who can navigate the more complicated aspects of ownership, because while she has authority, it is often conditional, dependent on agreements that can be interpreted in multiple ways. And interpretation, as it turns out, is a powerful tool. Now, let's gently move into social life, because while the widow may have independence, she is not entirely free to move as she pleases. Her presence at gatherings is noted. Her interactions are observed, and her behavior is quietly evaluated. Again, not harshly. Just consistently. She must maintain a balance. Friendly, but not too familiar. Engaged, but not too visible. Present, but not prominent. It's a delicate positioning, one that requires constant awareness, because stepping too far in any direction can invite attention, and attention, as we've seen, is not always helpful. Now let's consider companionship, because while independence offers space, it can also create distance. The widow may miss conversation, shared experience, the simple presence of another person who understands her daily life. And yet, seeking that companionship must be done carefully. Friendships are acceptable, encouraged even, but anything that resembles impropriety is not, because a widow's reputation is fragile. More so than a married woman's, more so than a young girl's. And exists in a kind of in-between state, respected, but easily questioned. So she chooses her interactions carefully, builds relationships that support her position, avoids those that might complicate it, and in doing so, she maintains her place. Now, let's talk about time again. Because time changes perception. As years pass, the widow becomes less noticeable. Not invisible, but less central. The curiosity fades, the attention softens. And in its place, there is familiarity. She becomes part of the landscape, a known figure, stable, predictable. And with that familiarity comes a kind of quiet security, because what is familiar is less likely to be challenged. Now, this does not mean her challenges disappear. They simply become manageable. Integrated into daily life, handled with the same quiet competence she has developed over time. Now, let's take a moment to consider something slightly more abstract. Control. Because throughout her life, control has been limited, defined by others, structured by expectation. But in widowhood, she experiences something different. Not full control, but influence. The ability to shape her environment, to make decisions that affect her daily life, to respond to challenges in ways that reflect her own judgment. And that influence, while subtle, is meaningful, because it represents a shift from being directed to directing, even if only in small ways. Now, as we let this part settle, we begin to see the complexity of widowhood more clearly. It is not simply a state of loss, nor is it purely a state of independence. It is both. Simultaneously. A balance between vulnerability and autonomy. Between visibility and caution. Between freedom and limitation. And navigating that balance requires skill, quiet, consistent skill, which the widow, over time, develops. Not because she was taught, but because she had to learn. And as we drift into the final part, we'll see how this balance evolves in the later years, because time, as always, has its own way of reshaping things. Softly. Gradually. Without much announcement. By the time the widow reaches her later years, something subtle has changed again, not in the world around her, that remains largely the same, structured, observant, quietly demanding. But in how she moves within it. The careful balancing act that once required constant attention now feels almost automatic. She no longer thinks about every decision. She simply makes them. The routines she built have settled into place. The household, if she still maintains one, runs with a kind of quiet efficiency. Servants know their roles. Expectations are understood. And Eleanor, if we may return to her name, no longer needs to prove that she belongs here. She already does. Now, let's take a slow look at her daily life, because the stage is less about change and more about continuity. Mornings arrive gently. There's no urgency to impress, no immediate pressure to fulfill a role she hasn't already fulfilled. Instead, there is a steady rhythm. She oversees what needs overseeing, addresses what needs addressing. And allows the rest to unfold. It's a quieter existence, not empty. Just less demanding. And in that quiet, there is something that has been largely absent from her earlier years. Choice. Small, simple choices: what to focus on, what to ignore. Where to spend her time. These are not grand freedoms, but they are hers. Now, her position within society has also shifted. She's no longer seen as an opportunity, not in the way younger widows are. No one is quietly evaluating her for remarriage. No one is considering her as a means of alliance. And while that may sound like a loss of importance, it is also a release, because without that attention, there's less scrutiny, less pressure to perform, less need to navigate the expectations of others. She becomes stable, a known presence, someone who exists within the community without needing to justify her place in it. And that stability is comfortable. Now, let's gently explore her relationships, because while her role as a wife has ended, her connections have not. If she has children, they are now adults, perhaps with households of their own, and her relationship with them has shifted from authority to guidance. She may offer advice, share observations, provide support when needed, but she is no longer responsible for shaping their lives. That responsibility has passed, and with it, a certain weight has lifted. Now, if she has grandchildren, her role becomes even softer, less structured, more present. She observes, participates when invited, and exists as a link between generations, a quiet continuity, not central, but significant. Now, let's return for a moment to the idea of reflection, because later years often bring it, not dramatically, not as a sweeping review of one's life, but in small moments, a memory here, a thought there. She may think back to her early years, the arrangements, the expectations, the quiet path that was laid out before her, and she may notice something interesting. She followed that path, carefully, consistently, not because she chose it, but because it was there. And in following it, she built a life, not one filled with dramatic change or bold decisions, but one that functioned, one that held together, which, in many ways, is its own kind of achievement. Now, does she wish things had been different? Perhaps in small fleeting ways, moments where she wonders what it might have been like to choose her own path, to define her own role from the beginning. But those thoughts do not linger, because they exist outside of what was possible. And Eleanor, having spent a lifetime navigating reality, does not dwell on impossibilities. She acknowledges them and lets them pass. Now, let's talk about legacy one last time, because in a world built on continuity, legacy is quiet. It is not always recorded in grand histories. It does not always appear in written accounts, but it exists. In the household she maintained. In the people she influenced. In the stability she preserved. Her legacy is not about transformation. It is about endurance. About maintaining structure in a world that relied on it. And while that may not seem remarkable, it is exactly what the system required. Consistency, reliability, presence, and she provided all of that. Without needing recognition beyond her immediate world. Now, as her days become slower, there is a noticeable shift in pace. Less movement, more stillness, more time spent in quiet spaces, gardens, rooms with soft light, places where the noise of daily life fades into the background. And in those spaces, there is something that has been rare throughout her life. Peace. Not perfect, not absolute, but enough. Enough to rest. Enough to simply be. Without expectation. Without pressure, without the need to perform a role. And perhaps for the first time, she experiences something close to a life that feels her own. Not entirely, but more than before. Now, as we gently approach the end of her story, there is no dramatic conclusion. No sudden realization. No final statement. Just a quiet continuation. Because lives like Eleanor's do not end with spectacle. They fade. Gradually, the same way they were lived. Steadily, without interruption. And as she becomes more memory than presence, the world around her continues. New marriages are arranged. New households are formed. New widows take her place within this quiet structure of society. And the pattern repeats. As it always has. As it always will. Somewhere, another woman sits in a quiet room, her life shifting in ways she did not choose, her role changing without ceremony, and she too will learn. To adapt. To navigate. To endure. Just as Eleanor did. And with that, we let the story settle. No urgency. No final lesson. Just the quiet understanding that widowhood, like so many parts of medieval life, was not a single experience, but a long, careful process of learning how to exist when the role you were given has quietly disappeared.